passage from 1 Kings positions us almost a quarter of the way through the prophet Elijah's cycle. We have moved past Elijah's confrontation with King Ahab and the 450 prophets of Baal, and now we hear King Ahab share his disdain about Elijah with Queen Jezebel, and she's not happy either. In fact, she has outright threatened Elijah. She has threatened his life much like Elijah threatened the lives of those remaining prophets of Baal. The geopolitical, economic, social, and political dimensions of the time and of their words were at a breaking point, and Elijah is terrified and maybe even a little troubled about what his next steps should be. Elijah was called to upend the tyrannical power systems and structures of the day, and in doing so, much like prophets before Elijah and those who would follow, found themselves in isolation. The prophetic call can have an overwhelming burden of speaking truth to power, which often produces social isolation, which can then engender mental anguish. And it did for Elijah. So much so that he uttered the words, "It is enough now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my ancestors." Perhaps it's hard to understand why Elijah would feel this way. With God on Elijah's side, he was able to stand for truth against power and to call out idol worship. Elizabeth Evans, in her commentary on this text, writes, quote, "Perhaps Elijah thought God's victory would get through to Ahab and his administration, and when he learns of Jezebel's crusade to kill him, he realizes his truth-telling has reverberated in ears that refuse to hear. Elijah flees to the wilderness, not necessarily for his life, as he asks God to let him die. He's hoping for escape from his calling, feeling overwhelmed by the task ahead, mistakenly believing that he alone must eradicate idolatry." End quote. Elijah was feeling it. He was tired, exhausted, vulnerable. And then he lay down under the broom tree and fell asleep. And suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, "Get up and eat." And this angel then serves as a travel guide, according to Gregory Seller. This travel guide helps Elijah in the desert, providing him with life-giving care over the next 40 days and nights. Rabbi Adam Morris, who answers questions and asks the rabbi for Seasons of the Spirit, writes, quote, "The rabbis interpret the significance from the first 40 we get in the story of Noah. And the rabbis suggest that 40 is important because, as they believed, 40 days after a child is conceived, the Talmud tells us the soul enters the body. 40, therefore, is a symbol of birth, rebirth, and change. A 16th century rabbi, Rabbi Judah Below, taught that 40 is a number that has the potential to raise someone's spiritual state. Well, Elijah's spiritual state needed to be raised. And Elizabeth Evans points out that God does not shame Elijah for his despair. Rather, God nourishes him with food and drink and allows him a 40-day retreat and coaxes him out of his cave in an unexpected way. And Elijah finds God not in the powerful wind, earthquake, or fire, but in the sound of sheer silence. Elijah received an unplanned sabbatical. And as we shift into a time of sabbatical, of time rest and renewal, a time to raise someone's spiritual state. I was intentional about picking an ordinary time of the church season. The season after Pentecost does not have any big high holy days. There's no extravagant liturgical events. It's not like Christmas or Easter. There's a regular flow of things. Summer lends a different rhythm, a more relaxed rhythm perhaps. And to hear that Elijah needed to pause too is reassuring. And yet, the Elijah story gets at the heart of what we are feeling as a congregation and for me as your pastor. What are we going to do next? And where is God calling us to be? And frankly, where are you, God? Specifically, C. Melissa Snar writes that these kind of scripture stories we hear in ordinary time plunge us into a communal formation and discipleship and help us to think about what happens after big events in our community. She writes, quote, whether it be a victory or exile, where is God when the community is exhausted and has a desperate need for reassurance? Ecclesially, these passages speak particularly to the struggle of faithfulness when final victory seems exceedingly elusive and time is infused with the brutal reality of unrelenting everyday politics and suffering. These scriptures invite us to reflect on how we embody God when we are not in power and even lack certainty about how the future will unfold. How do we look for the presence of God when we are in despair about our missional future? End quote. Folks, we have been through a great deal in my 13 and a half years here. New partnerships with community organizations, like the local rec centers and early learning coalitions, creating a child care center, ceilings caving in, a literal sewage show in our kitchen downstairs, violence and crime, and then add financial fraud before and during a pandemic. This is not to mention the world events that have come to our attention during this time. Gun violence in schools and churches and grocery stores, humanitarian crises like the one in Ukraine, the impending climate crisis, and the death-dealing policies against transgender youth and don't say gay. The magnitude of the work of God calls people of faith to do is as big as the earthquake Elijah felt. And God, we are overwhelmed and tired and feel helpless and powerless like Elijah. What can we possibly do to make a dent in the injustices God calls us to challenge? The sheer enormity of the task, the willful ignorance of those with institutional power, and the lie that we must work alone all present us with the temptation of fleeing to our caves and abandoning our call. This Sunday alone calls us to task. This Sunday is Juneteenth, the commemoration of the 1865 announcement to the last enslaved people in Texas that the Civil War had ended and they were free. While rightfully observed as a celebration for Black Americans, Juneteenth should also serve as a reminder to white Americans of both the long prevalence of the shameful evils of racism and the work that remains to be done, and the ongoing work of anti-racism in all facets of American society, the workplace, the criminal justice system, and the voting booth, to name a few, feels insurmountable. At times, I just want to go hide. The cave is calling me. How about you? And yet, even in the silence, God comes to us with nourishment and encouragement. We are not isolated from God or from faithful community, even if we cannot recognize it. Faithful relationships with God And others write, see Melissa Snar, are a part of the divine sustenance that enables us to persist in our missional calling. God assures that care will present itself, but we must also yet say yes to it. Sometimes walking toward it in a literal, physical manner. We must also know that divine care and revelation will not look, sound, or feel the same for everyone, but rather will meet us in our particular need. The passage from 1 Kings does not offer a simple, warm, fuzzy kind of care, especially for extended licking of wounds, which sometimes means they never heal. Instead, Snar writes, it is our challenge to embrace the steady care and faith in us that God offers. You are not alone. I care for you. Now get back to it. I encourage us in this time of sabbatical, this intentional time of leave-taking, to take some time in a cave, like Elijah, lean into the silence, and rest assured that when we gather in the fall again, we will be different, and hopefully our spirits will be a little more renewed, and we will definitely get back to it. Thanks be to God.